What if I told you there's a single psalm, so charged with divine power, that if you speak it for just 7 days, it could shatter financial barriers, dissolve debts, and open the floodgates of abundance into your life? But before we begin, make sure to hit that like button, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're joining us from today. Keynote 1. The power of the spoken word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The entire universe was formed by the vibration of the spoken word, and from that divine vibration, all things came into being. Every time you open your mouth to speak, you are using the same creative force that spoke the heavens, the earth, and the stars into existence. Words are not idle. Words are not empty. Words are alive, and they carry within them the seeds of creation. When you speak in alignment with truth, your words become channels for miracles. To speak a psalm is not merely to recite poetry from sacred scripture. It is to awaken divine law. It is to activate a frequency that reshapes the unseen and calls forth the seen. When you speak a psalm aloud, you are clothing yourself with God's vibration. You are affirming not just with your lips, but with your very breath that God's promises are true. You are commanding your world to come into harmony with the divine order. The spoken word holds the power to dissolve financial barriers. Many believe their lack is due to circumstance, economy, or the actions of others. Yet in truth, lack is only the shadow of misaligned thought and misdirected words. Every complaint is a decree. Every fear spoken aloud is a seed sown into the soil of experience. When someone says, "I can't afford it," or "money never stays with me," they are unconsciously writing the script for their life. The universe does not question whether the decree is wanted or unwanted. It simply brings forth the harvest. This is why the psalm is so powerful. It is the word of God spoken through you, overriding the false decrees of fear and lack that may have lingered in your subconscious mind. When you speak a psalm for 7 days, you are planting a divine truth over and over again into the fertile soil of your spirit. Each repetition waters the seed until the vibration of lack is drowned out by the vibration of abundance. The spoken word is a command to the subconscious. The subconscious mind does not argue. It does not question. It only obeys. If you tell it that you are poor, it will ensure that you experience poverty. If you tell it that wealth flows to you freely, it will set into motion events, connections, and circumstances to make it so. The psalm of financial breakthrough, when spoken aloud, bypasses human reasoning and imprints the truth of divine provision directly into the subconscious. It is as though you are reprogramming the soul, aligning it with God's abundance instead of human limitation. Every word carries a vibration. Some words create heaviness and darkness, while others bring light, healing, and prosperity. The psalm is a divine vibration. It is not just language. It is energy encoded with spiritual law. To speak it daily is to tune yourself as an instrument into the harmony of heaven's supply. As a harp vibrates with the touch of a hand, so your life vibrates with the words you speak. Faith is released through the spoken word. Many hold faith silently in their hearts. But faith becomes dynamic when it is declared aloud. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. You redeem yourself from the appearance of lack. When you speak prosperity over your life, the spoken word ignites faith, and faith draws into form the invisible riches already prepared for you. Consider this. Money, opportunities, open doors, and unexpected gifts already exist in the realm of spirit. They are not being created. They are being revealed. The spoken word acts as the key that opens the curtain between the invisible and the visible. Without the spoken word, blessings remain suspended in potential. With the spoken word, blessings are commanded into manifestation. The psalm you choose to speak becomes your decree of truth. Every line is a command to your world. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. When you speak those words, you are not begging God to provide. You are declaring the law of supply. You are affirming that want cannot exist in the presence of divine shepherding. Lack dissolves as a shadow before the sun. He prepareth a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. To speak this is to declare that abundance flows regardless of opposition, regardless of circumstance, regardless of human limitation. The psalm becomes your spiritual sword, just as the word was used to rebuke the adversary in the wilderness. So you wield the psalm against the thought forms of fear, doubt, and poverty. Every time you speak it, you cut away the cords of worry and tie yourself to the promises of provision. It is not enough to think abundance. You must speak it. Thinking alone keeps the truth contained within your mind. Speaking releases it into the atmosphere, sets it vibrating in your body, and declares it before heaven and earth. The spoken word gathers power as it moves through sound. It is like the striking of a bell once sounded. Its vibration travels far beyond the moment. Your words ripple through the unseen, touching people, places, and situations you may never meet. This is why the psalm spoken aloud is so potent. When you whisper it into the quiet of the night, declare it into the stillness of the morning. It does not remain in that room. It travels outward, reaching the divine substance that is ready to shape itself into supply. It reaches opportunities that are meant for you. It reaches the hearts of others who are destined to bless you. It reshapes the energy field around you until your life reflects the very words you have spoken. Every decree becomes flesh. Just as the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, so too will the words you speak become flesh in your experience. If you decree poverty, you will dwell among poverty. If you decree wealth, you will dwell among wealth. The psalm is a holy decree already charged with divine energy. When you join your voice to it, you activate it personally, aligning your life with the same law that governs the stars. The spoken word carries authority when it is spoken with belief. This is why faith is essential. To repeat the psalm without belief is to strike the air, but to repeat it with inner conviction is to strike the ground with a rod that brings water from the rock. You must speak it knowing that every word is alive. You must speak it as though you already see the table prepared, the cup running over, the blessings following you all the days of your life. When you speak, speak with expectancy. Do not murmur the words as if they are ritual. Speak to them with the fire of truth. Speak them as though heaven listens, because it does. Speak them as though angels are dispatched with every syllable, because they are. Speak them as though God Himself is watching over His word to perform it, because He is. The spoken word is a how to speak the word with faith, divine law in action. The psalm is not just poetry, not just prayer, not just inspiration. It is a creative decree. Each day you speak it for 7 days. You send forth a command that shapes your financial world. The walls of debt begin to crumble. The doors of opportunity begin to swing open. The channels of provision begin to flow all through the power of the spoken word. 7 represents completion. The number 7 is not ordinary. It is the divine symbol of spiritual perfection, wholeness, and completion. Throughout the sacred texts, 7 appears again and again as the number of God's perfect order. Creation itself was completed in 7 days. On the 7th day, God rested, for the work was finished. The walls of Jericho fell after 7 days of marching and 7 blasts of the trumpet. Ammon the leper was cleansed after dipping 7 times in the Jordan River. The number 7 signifies the end of struggle and the manifestation of fulfillment. When you speak a psalm for 7 days, you are aligning yourself with this divine law of completion. You are declaring that what God has promised you shall come to pass in full. Not partially, not halfway, but in completion. 7 seals are broken. 7 lamps burn before the throne. 7 represent the cycle of manifestation brought to its fullness. In the rhythm of 7, your financial breakthrough is brought from the unseen into the seen, from promise into possession, from prayer into reality. To repeat the psalm for 7 days is to move through a spiritual cycle. Each day carries its own vibration, and each day layers upon the last until the fullness is revealed. On the first day, you sow the seed of truth. On the second day, the seed takes root. On the third day, it pushes through the soil. On the fourth day, it grows strong. On the fifth day, it begins to bear the promise of fruit. On the sixth day, it reaches maturity. On the seventh day, the harvest is complete. 7 days is a cycle of creation. And within that cycle, what you decree becomes established. 7 is the divine stamp of approval. To speak the psalm 7 days in a row is to place your desire under God's perfect timing, God's perfect order, and God's perfect manifestation. Many grow weary when they do not see results at once. Yet the number 7 teaches patience. For just as a seed does not bear fruit the day it is planted, so your financial miracle matures as you remain faithful in declaration. 7 days symbolize the trust that God's word does not return void. It works silently, invisibly, and unfailingly until it is accomplished. Every day you repeat the psalm, you are chiseling away at the walls of resistance, just as the Israelites circled Jericho for 6 days in silence, and only on the 7th day lifted their voices. So you circle your own walls of lack with faith-filled words. Each repetition weakens the stronghold of fear and limitation, until on the 7th day, the final vibration of your word collapses every barrier, and your blessing is released into your hands. 7 is persistence. 7 is trust. 7 is the sound of victory. The subconscious mind is deeply impressed by repetition. To speak the psalm once may stir inspiration, but to speak it 7 days in succession imprints it permanently upon the soul. Each day deepens the groove of truth within you, replacing old patterns of fear with divine patterns of faith. By the 7th day, your entire inner being has been saturated with the vibration of abundance. You have shifted your frequency, and in that shift, the outer world must mirror the change. The number 7 also represents spiritual cleansing. Naaman was not healed after the first dip, nor the second, nor the third. He was told to dip 7 times, and only on the 7th did his flesh become whole. Why? Because the process of 7 completes the cleansing. The first dips wash away doubt. The next wash away fear, and by the 7th every barrier to healing is gone. So it is with your finances. Speaking the psalm for 7 days washes away the thought forms of poverty 1 layer at a time. Each day you speak it, fear loosens its grip. Each day you speak it, doubt is washed away. By the 7th day, the cleansing is complete and the truth of abundance stands revealed. 7 is also the number of rest. On the 7th day, God rested not because of weariness, but because the work was finished. When you speak the psalm, for 7 days you are led into that same rest. You no longer strive, you worry. You no longer labor in fear. You rest in the assurance that the word has accomplished its purpose. Rest is not inactivity. It is divine confidence. To rest is to know that God has gone before you, that doors are opening, that provision is flowing, that supply is already here. When you align with the number 7, you align with cycles of divine timing. Many attempt to force manifestation in their own time, yet true miracles unfold in God's time. 7 days of speaking the psalm teaches you to surrender. It teaches you that prosperity does not come by anxiety or struggle, but by obedience and faith. You release the how, you release the when, and you allow divine order to bring forth the supply in perfect rhythm. Every day of the 7 has its spiritual significance. The first day represents faith, the seed planted. The second represents trust, the root taking hold. The third represents growth, movement. Florence Scovel Shinn's teachings on abundance beneath the surface. The fourth represents strength, stability being established. The fifth represents grace, favor, multiplying. The sixth represents readiness, the blessing about to break through. The 7th represents fulfillment, completion, manifestation, and rest. As you move through the 7 days, You are moving through a spiritual journey that ends in the fullness of your blessing. The angels themselves operate in cycles of 7. 7 trumpets, 7 stars, 7 churches. Heaven's order is established in sevens. To speak the psalm for 7 days is to place yourself in alignment with this angelic rhythm. It is as though you are stepping into the same vibration that governs the cosmos, aligning your personal life with the harmony of the universe. 7 carries within it the vibration of eternity. It is the bridge between the seen and the unseen. When you complete the 7-day cycle of speaking the psalm, you are not merely reciting words. You are entering a covenant of completion. You are affirming that your financial breakthrough is not a possibility, but a certainty. For the same God who completed creation in 7 days is completing your miracle in perfect order. The appearance of lack is always temporary, but the law of 7 ensures its end. Poverty cannot stand before the rhythm of divine completion. Delay cannot resist the power of spiritual cycles. When you speak the psalm for 7 days, you are declaring the end of delay, the end of struggle, the end of unfinished prayers. You are standing in the vibration of completion, and completion brings manifestation. The power of 7 is the power of perseverance. Many stop before the 7th day, not realizing that the final breakthrough was about to unfold. Yet those who remain faithful see the fullness of blessing. Speaking the psalm 7 days in succession is a spiritual test of faithfulness. Do you believe enough to persist? Do you trust enough to complete the cycle? For those who do, the 7th day always brings revelation, always brings release, always brings the miracle into view. The psalm is a spiritual key. Every psalm is a doorway, a key fashioned not by human hands, but by divine inspiration. Within each verse lies a hidden vibration, a frequency that unlocks spiritual law and dissolves the illusions of fear and lack. To the unawakened eye, a psalm may appear as poetry, as words strung together in beauty. But to the awakened soul, a psalm is a living key, a code that when spoken with faith, opens treasures hidden in the unseen. Keys are meant to open doors, and the psalm you speak is the key to doors that appear closed in your life. The door of financial freedom, the door of opportunity, the door of divine provision. These doors do not open by human effort alone. They open when the right key is turned in the lock. The psalm is that key. It carries the exact vibration needed to dissolve barriers and release blessings. When you take up psalm upon your lips, you are not merely reciting history. You are activating eternal truth. You are aligning yourself with the law of supply, the law of abundance, the law of divine provision. Each line is a decree that cancels the false evidence of lack and affirms the reality of God's overflowing goodness. The psalm is not passive. It is active, alive, and creative. Consider this. In the material world, a key is small, yet it can unlock massive doors. The same is true spiritually. One psalm spoken in faith has the power to open doors that years of struggle could not. One psalm faithfully repeated can shift the course of your financial destiny. One psalm spoken as a decree can collapse walls of resistance and usher in miracles beyond imagination. The psalm is a key because it holds within it divine authority. It is not your word alone. It is God's word spoken through you. When you speak it, you are not pleading or begging. You are commanding according to divine law. You are not hoping vaguely. You are unlocking specifically. Just as a key is cut to fit a particular lock, so each psalm is designed to address particular needs. The psalm of provision unlocks supply. The psalm of protection unlocks safety. The psalm of guidance unlocks wisdom. When you speak the psalm for 7 days, you are turning the key again and again in the lock until the door opens wide. Each repetition strengthens your faith, chisels away at resistance, and aligns you more perfectly with divine law. At first, the lock may seem stiff, rusted by years of doubt and fear, but persistence is the turning of the key, and by the 7th day, the door swings open, revealing shifting from lack to prosperity mindset, treasures long prepared for you. The psalm is also a key, because it bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the soul. Your conscious mind may argue, may question, may doubt, but the psalm carries a vibration that slips past human reasoning and imprints truth upon the subconscious. You may not fully understand why it works, just as one may not understand the mechanics of a lock. But when you use the key, the door opens whether you comprehend it or not. The psalm does not require your intellectual approval. It requires your faith. Hidden within the psalm are divine codes. The rhythm, the repetition, the poetic cadence, all of it is intentional. Each word is chosen not only for meaning but for vibration. When spoken aloud, the psalm produces a resonance within your body, your spirit, and your environment. It shifts the frequency of your atmosphere, aligning it with abundance. It calls forth the divine pattern of supply, dissolving the false pattern of lack. The psalm as a key also reveals itself through affirmation. When you speak, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," you are affirming a law that overrides appearances. You may see bills on the table. You may feel the weight of debt. You may fear the uncertainty of tomorrow. But when you speak the psalm, you insert the key into the lock of truth. You declare, "Want is an illusion, for the Lord is my shepherd, and the lock of lack is undone." Every key must be used in the right way. A key cannot unlock a door if it remains in your pocket. Likewise, a psalm cannot unlock abundance if it remains on the page. It must be spoken, declared, and affirmed with faith. When you lift the words off the page and breathe them into life, the key is turned. The spiritual mechanism moves, and the door begins to yield. The psalm is also a key of remembrance. In moments of fear, when your mind is clouded, the psalm brings you back to truth. It reminds you of God's promises. It reminds you that provision is not earned through toil alone, but received through alignment with divine law. Speaking the psalm 7 days is like returning again and again to the door, never forgetting that you carry the key. Fear says the door is locked forever. Faith says, "No, I have the key and this door must open." The psalm as a spiritual key reveals that abundance is not something you must chase, it is something you must unlock. The supply already exists, waiting behind the door of spirit. Your job is not to create it, but to access it. And the psalm spoken with faith is the precise key that fits the lock. Imagine standing before a great treasury, filled with gold, silver, precious stones, and wealth beyond measure. The door is shut, but the key rests in your hand. That treasury is the abundance of God already prepared for you. The psalm is the key in your hand. All that is required is to turn it, to speak it, to believe it. And as you do, the treasury opens, pouring forth supply into your life. The key of the psalm also works silently. Just as a key turns the tumblers of a lock unseen, so the psalm shifts realities in the invisible. You may not see movement at once, but the unseen mechanism is turning. Opportunities are being prepared. Helpers are being sent. Debts are being canceled. Doors are being unlocked. The psalm does its work silently, invisibly, until suddenly the door swings wide, and what was locked away is revealed. Keys carry authority. When you hold the key, you do not beg at the door. You do not plead with the lock. You turn the key knowing it will open. The psalm gives you that same authority. It transforms your prayers from begging into decreeing. You no longer stand outside in fear. You stand with the key in hand, declaring, "This door must open, for I hold the key of truth." The psalm is not a key you use once and discard. It becomes your lifelong access. Once you discover the power of speaking the word, you realize that no door is permanently locked to you. Every time lack tries to appear, you reach again for the key. Every time fear whispers, you turn again to the psalm. And each time the door yields, for the word is eternal, and the key never loses its power. The psalm is not merely read. It is lived. As you speak it for 7 days, you begin to embody it. The words are no longer outside of you. They are within you. You become the psalm itself, walking in the assurance of its truth. You become the living key, unlocking abundance wherever you go. The psalm shapes your vibration, until your very presence carries the authority to open doors, shifting from fear to faith. Fear is the great thief of mankind. It robs the soul of peace. It blinds the eyes to opportunity, and it shackles the hands that are meant to receive abundance. Fear whispers of lack, of insufficiency, of failure. It paints images of bills unpaid, doors closed, and futures uncertain. Yet fear is not truth, it is shadow. It is the absence of faith. And like a shadow, it disappears when light shines upon it. Faith is the light. Where fear says there is not enough, faith declares the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Where fear says you will lose everything, faith responds, no good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. Fear creates lack in the imagination, but faith creates supply in reality. To shift from fear to faith is to step out of the shadow and into the sunlight. It is to move from bondage into freedom, from scarcity into overflow. Every psalm you speak is a bridge from fear to faith. When fear presses upon the heart, when worry repeats itself in the mind, the psalm comes as a divine interruption. It breaks the cycle of fearful thought and replaces it with the vibration of truth. Each word becomes a ladder lifting you from the pit of anxiety into the heights of assurance. Speaking the psalm aloud is not simply recitation, it is transformation. It shifts the inner climate from storm to stillness, from darkness to light, from trembling to triumph. Fear is magnetic. What one dreads, one draws. When a soul says, I fear losing my money, that fear becomes a decree and circumstances align with it. Fear plants seeds of poverty in the subconscious, and the harvest appears in reality. But faith too is magnetic. What one expects, releasing limiting beliefs and poverty blocks with faith, one attracts. When the heart says, God is my unfailing supply, that faith becomes a decree and channels of provision open. Faith plants seeds of abundance, and the harvest is plentiful. The psalm is the sacred tool that shifts the soil of the subconscious, pulling out the weeds of fear and planting seeds of faith. Fear is born of seeing only the visible. It looks at the bank account, the stack of bills, the empty wallet, and concludes there is not enough. But faith looks beyond the visible and sees the invisible. Faith declares that supply does not come from numbers on a page, but from the infinite storehouse of God. Faith knows that provision is not limited by salary, economy, or circumstance, but flows freely from the divine source. The psalm, when spoken, teaches the soul to see with faith. It trains the eyes to look past appearances and behold the truth of divine supply. When you speak, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? You are affirming that fear has no dominion over you. You are declaring that light exposes every illusion, and salvation delivers you from every shadow. Fear trembles before faith-filled words. The moment you speak truth, fear begins to dissolve. It cannot remain where faith is declared, for light and darkness cannot occupy the same space. Fear often disguises itself as caution, as logic, as realism. It says, be careful, be reasonable, prepare for the worst. Yet hidden within these whispers is doubt in God's provision. Faith does not deny reality. It transcends it. Faith says, though appearances show lack, I know God's abundance is at hand. Faith is not reckless. It is resolute. It stands upon the word as upon a solid rock, unmoved by winds of circumstance. The psalm anchors you in this rock of faith, so that fear's waves crash and fall away powerless. Shifting from fear to faith is not always instant. Just as the dawn gradually pushes back the night, so faith gradually pushes back fear with each spoken word. The first day you speak the psalm, fear may still whisper. The second day its voice grows weaker. By the seventh day, faith has risen fully, and fear is silenced. Repetition is the tool of transformation. Each recitation of the psalm strengthens faith's hold upon the soul, until it becomes unshakable. Fear contracts, faith expands. When fear rules, the body tightens, the mind narrows, and possibilities seem few. But when faith reigns, the spirit opens, the mind broadens, and opportunities multiply. Fear says there is no way. Faith says, God makes a way where there is no way. Fear sees walls. Faith sees doors. Fear sees impossibility. Faith sees miracles. By speaking the psalm, you choose expansion over contraction. Faith over fear, miracles over limitations. Fear drains energy. It exhausts the soul by replaying imagined disasters. But faith restores energy, filling the heart with joy, peace, and expectancy. Fear weighs heavily, but faith lifts high. The psalm is your tool to shift weight to wings, to exchange heaviness for lightness. When you declare, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life," you lift the soul from fear's burden into faith's freedom. Fear is a prison, but faith is the key. Many live locked in the cell of financial worry, rehearsing lack in their minds, expecting loss at every turn. Yet the door of that prison is already unlocked. The psalm is the key in your hand. Speak it and the door swings wide. Step into faith and freedom is yours. Fear is the belief in a power apart from God. It says something can harm me, something can block my supply, something can defeat me. But faith knows there is no power apart from God. Faith says, if God is for me, who can be against me? Faith knows that nothing and no one can stop what God has ordained. The psalm is the voice of faith, reminding you that God's power is supreme, that no shadow can overcome the light, and no lack can withstand the abundance of divine law. Fear clings to the past and worries for the future. Faith rests in the now. Fear replays yesterday's failures and imagines tomorrow's troubles. Faith says, now is the acceptable time. Today is the day of salvation. Affirmations for wealth and divine supply. Speaking the psalm brings you into the eternal present, where God's supply flows freely. You are reminded that abundance is not tomorrow's promise, but today's reality. Fear divides the mind, but faith unites it. A double-minded man wavers between doubt and belief, and such wavering delays manifestation. But when the mind is united in faith, manifestation is swift. The psalm unites the mind. Each line spoken aloud gathers scattered thoughts, dissolves doubt, and anchors belief. In this unity, miracles are birthed. Shifting from fear to faith is the greatest financial strategy. It is not found in the marketplace, nor in the banks, nor in the opinions of men. It is found in the heart that dares to believe God's word over every appearance. It is found in the voice that dares to speak the psalm until fear is silenced and faith resounds. Fear says, I cannot. Faith says, with God all things are possible. Fear says, I will fail. Faith says, the Lord is my strength and my shield. Fear says, I am alone. Faith says, surely I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Expectancy as the bridge to manifestation. Expectation is the golden bridge between the invisible and the visible, between prayer and possession, between promise and fulfillment. To expect is to stand with hands open and heart ready, knowing that what has been spoken shall surely come to pass. Without expectation, words fall empty like seeds scattered on stone. But with expectation, every word becomes alive. A seed planted in fertile soil that must bear fruit. When you speak a psalm for 7 days, it is not enough to repeat it mechanically. You must expect, you must believe that the words are alive, that the law of God is already in motion, that your financial breakthrough is not a distant dream, but an imminent reality. Expectancy is the magnet that draws the unseen supply into visible form. It is the open door through which abundance enters. Expectation is not wishing. Wishing carries with it doubt, the quiet fear that perhaps the prayer will not be answered. Expectation is certainty. It is the unwavering knowing that what you have declared is already yours. Expectation does not look around nervously for evidence. It rests in the assurance that the evidence is already on its way. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Expectancy is that substance, that evidence, the unseen proof that manifests into seen results. Every great miracle begins with expectation. The woman who touched the hem of Christ's garment expected healing before she touched. The centurion expected the word alone to heal his servant, and it was done. Expectation is the atmosphere in which miracles thrive. Without it, blessings may stand at the door unnoticed. With it, blessings are welcomed in and received with joy. To expect a financial breakthrough is to see beyond the empty purse, the overdue bill, the locked opportunity. Expectation lifts the eyes from appearances to divine truth. It declares, though my bank account appears empty, I expect overflow. Though the way seems shut, I expect the door to open. Though circumstances speak of lack, I expect abundance. Expectation does not deny what is seen, it transcends it. It sees the unseen supply already flowing and declares it into manifestation. Expectation is an act of agreement with God. When you expect, you are saying, I agree with your word. I agree that you are my shepherd and I shall not want. I agree that you supply all my needs according to your riches in glory. I agree that goodness and mercy follow me all the days of my life. To expect is to stand in harmony with heaven's decree, aligning your faith with divine promise. Every day you speak the psalm, you must couple it with expectation. Without expectation, the psalm is sound without substance. But with expectation, the psalm becomes a decree that summons supply. Imagine planting a seed in the soil, and then expecting nothing to grow. The very act would seem foolish, yet many speak words without expectation. They plant and walk away in doubt. Expectation is the gardener's faith. It knows that the seed must sprout, must blossom, must bear fruit. Expectation is also joy before manifestation. It is rejoicing as though the blessing is already in hand. The expectant soul does not wait to celebrate until money arrives. It celebrates now knowing the money is already on its way. Gratitude in advance is the song of expectancy. Each time you thank God before the walking in overflow, and gratitude blessing appears, you strengthen the bridge of manifestation. Thanksgiving is proof of faith, and proof of faith opens the door wide to supply. Expectation carries a vibration that calls forth provision. The anxious mind repels, but the expectant heart attracts. Expectation is like a lighthouse sending out a steady beam that guides abundance to your shore. It is the fragrance that draws opportunity. It is the signal that the blessing has a place to land. The universe responds to expectancy for it. It is faith made visible in attitude, speech, and atmosphere. The psalm itself teaches expectancy. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. The word surely is not timid. It is expectant. It is a declaration of certainty. When you speak it, you do not say maybe goodness and mercy will follow me. You say, surely they shall. That is expectancy. It is not hope tinged with fear, but assurance filled with joy. When you walk in expectation, you carry yourself differently. Your words shift. Your posture shifts. Your atmosphere shifts. You no longer speak of lack, you speak of provision. You no longer carry the heaviness of worry. You carry the lightness of faith. Expectancy shines through you and others see it. People are drawn to bless the expectant soul. Opportunities flow toward it and doors open before it. Expectation is the aura of abundance. Expectation must be guarded, for fear and doubt seek to steal it. Negative words, discouraging voices, and appearances of delay all attempt to shake expectancy. But the soul anchored in the psalm remains firm. Each day you speak it, you renew your expectation. Each day you remind yourself that God is faithful, that His word does not return void, and that your financial breakthrough is certain. Expectation is strengthened through repetition until it becomes unshakable. To expect is to prepare. When rain is promised, the wise bring a vessel to catch it. When abundance is expected, the wise prepare to receive it. This preparation is an act of faith. It may be as simple as clearing debts with the expectation of overflow, opening a new account for expected income, or speaking daily affirmations of gratitude for supply. Preparation proves expectancy. It demonstrates that you truly believe abundance is coming, and in that belief abundance flows. Expectation transforms delay into a process. The soul without expectation sees delay as denial. But the expectant heart knows delay is not denial. It is preparation. Just as fruit takes time to ripen, so does manifestation. Expectancy trusts the process. It waits not in anxiety but in joy, knowing that the blessing is maturing, that the harvest is ripening, and that at the appointed time the supply will appear in full. Expectation is a choice. At every moment, you may choose to expect fear's outcome or faith's outcome. You may expect lack or you may expect abundance. You may expect failure or you may expect success. The psalm is the divine compass, guiding your expectation toward truth. Each word points your soul toward abundance, until expectation becomes your natural state. When you expect a financial breakthrough, you magnetize the very channels through which it flows. You become sensitive to divine guidance, alert to opportunities, open to unexpected blessings. Expectancy sharpens intuition so that when God whispers a direction, you hear it. Expectancy heightens awareness so that when a door opens, you step through it. Without expectation, blessings may pass unnoticed. With expectation, nothing is missed. Expectation is the bridge and gratitude is the golden pavement upon it. Every thank you spoken in advance lays another stone on the bridge. Every joyful declaration strengthens its structure. The more you expect, the stronger the bridge becomes until manifestation walks across it, final blessing and prosperity prayer unhindered. Expectation is the law of faith in motion. The psalm is the word. Expectation is the belief. Manifestation is the result. Speak the psalm. Expect the promise and receive the fulfillment. Beloved soul, the psalm you speak is not mere poetry. It is a living decree, a divine code of abundance, and a bridge between heaven's storehouse and your earthly life. You have learned that the spoken word carries creative power, shaping unseen forces into visible supply. You have seen that the 7 days of repetition are not ritual but completion. The sealing of heaven's promise in perfect order. You have discovered that the psalm itself is a key unlocking doors that fear once shut. You have recognized the shift from fear into faith, where worry dissolves and peace reigns, and you have walked across the golden bridge of expectancy knowing that what you declare with faith is already on its way. As you speak this psalm for 7 days, remember it is not the length of your words, but the depth of your belief that moves mountains. Every syllable carries vibration. Every affirmation carries life. Every expectation carries manifestation. Speak it not with doubt, but with certainty. Speak it not as a beggar, but as a child of the King, claiming the inheritance that has always been yours. See yourself already supplied. See doors swinging wide. See debts dissolving, opportunities multiplying, and divine channels opening. Let your heart be filled with gratitude now, not later. Let thanksgiving be your song before the harvest arrives. For in truth, the harvest is already yours. For 7 days you speak, but the vibration continues beyond the days. The words echo in the unseen, commanding substance to take form, compelling blessings to flow, calling money, provision, and opportunity into your hands. The psalm is alive. It works even when you rest. It moves even when you are still. Hold fast in faith. Expect with joy. Stand in assurance. For the same God who made you has also made your supply, and he withholds no good thing from you. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow you. Surely abundance shall overtake you. Surely a financial breakthrough is your divine right, and it is unfolding